Good evening and welcome to today's event on Can Transparency in Government Stop Corruption? This policy and practice seminar is jointly hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science, the UCL School of Public Policy, and the UCL Policy Lab. My name is Christian Schuster, I'm a professor in the department, and I'll be your chair for tonight. Today's seminar tackles one of the major challenges we face as societies today, and that is corruption. We know from hundreds of studies that corruption undermines economic growth, undermines the trust in government, undermines public service delivery. So then the question, of course, is, what can we do about it? So far, our track record on this hasn't been great. In most countries of the world, corruption is getting worse. The UK is a good example. And so the question is, what do we do? And can transparency, as one of the antidotes, help us? And we have two distinguished speakers today to shed light on this question. To my left is Duncan Hames, who is Director of Policy at Transparency International, where he leads the public policy, business integrity, and research teams. He was previously an MP and a parliamentary private secretary to then Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. To my right is Mihaly Fazekas. He's an associate professor at the Central European University and the scientific director of the Government Transparency Institute. That is a think tank at the forefront of using big data to enhance transparency and fight corruption. We were going to be joined by a third panelist tonight, Professor Liz David Barrett from the University of Sussex. Unfortunately, she had a medical emergency, so she had to pull out, so we have an all-male panel, and I do want to apologize for that. That's not what we normally have, but we have it because of this situation. So, in terms of the structure of tonight's event, we have two interventions by each of our speakers. We have first Duncan Hames speaking for 10 minutes, then Mihaly Fazekas speaking for 10 minutes. Then we have about a 15-minute panel discussion, and then we have lots of time for questions. So please do bring your questions to our panelists. Before I hand over to our speakers, this whole session is recorded. So if you say something in this session, that will be recorded, including in the Q&A, and will go live on YouTube. If you do not say anything, you will not appear on YouTube and you will not go live online. We'll let you know when the recording is available. Once you receive it, please do share it with your friends and with others. So with that said, let's move to our first speaker. Duncan Hames, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's my privilege to be the principal spokesperson for Transparency International UK and our work tackling corruption in the UK and the UK's contribution to corruption around the world. We are part of a worldwide coalition against corruption. That's a movement in more than 100 countries, and I'm always very conscious that the work that I do in the UK is in the comfortable seats, and it's my colleagues in other parts of the world who face very severe threats to their work because it's a very contentious subject, and it's one which often brings them into harm's way. But it's often the insights that we gain from our colleagues elsewhere in the world that both help us in our work here in the UK and also motivate us to make sure that the UK doesn't contribute to their problems. It's my job to hold a mirror up to the political class in the UK and show them that corruption isn't just something that happens in hot countries where the politicians wear military uniforms. And actually, in our own way, and we don't actually use the word corruption very much in the UK, do we? You hear the word sleaze a lot. There are other kind of euphemisms for corruption in Britain because somehow that's not a word that we could use to describe our own society. But actually, in our own way, we have very serious corruption problems. And it's not just me who thinks that, but that's recognised in the Corruption Perceptions Index, which published by Transparency International is actually an analysis of a collection of different indicators from business people and experts in this field from around the world. And the UK's ranking has dropped to its lowest level in 10 years in that index. And that reflects alarm, I think, in those quarters about the way this issue's still very real here in the UK. So it might surprise you to hear me say that transparency alone is not enough to stop corruption. And I make no apology for that. Transparency is not an end in itself. We see transparency as a means to accountability. And without accountability, transparency fails to provide any leverage to tackle this issue. So I think it's worth looking at what we need for accountability to exist. So first of all, I think we need clear expectations, something against which you can be held to account. So in public life, we have the Nolan principles, which many politicians at various junctures find that they sign up to, the principles of public life, which are 30 years old now, and include openness and honesty and leadership. And these are referred to in codes of conduct. The members of parliament have a code of conduct, but so do ministers in our government. So that's how expectations are set. You need clarity as to what is actually happening. And there are ways in which transparency can bring that. We could have a register of lobbying. We have a lobbying act in this country, but we don't have a register of lobbying. We have a register of consultant lobbyists, which barely touches the surface of what happens in political lobbying in this country. You could have a register of political donations. Now, that's something we do have and have had for 25 years now, which is quite useful for understanding where money interfaces with politics. And we also have registers of financial interests. These exist in a lot of public bodies amongst senior decision makers, but they're most prominent amongst our politicians. So members of the House of Commons and indeed members of the House of Lords make declarations against a register outlining their own financial interests. And this is designed to help us understand, this transparency measure is designed to help us understand when their own private interests come into conflict with objective decision making in the public interest. We also need an ability to have a public examination of any transgressions against those expectations, which I described earlier. I want to say how important an independent media is for that. And the investigative journalists are essential partners of ours in the work we do in the United Kingdom. And yet the business model for journalism is under an awful lot of challenge currently. And in different countries around the world, the freedoms by which journalists operate are restricted. And that challenges our ability to bring about a public examination when our public officials are not living up to the expectations that are set for them. But here in the UK, as well as that, we have formal mechanisms whereby we can have accountability, select committee hearings in the Parliament, independent investigations. The Prime Minister has an independent advisor on ministerial interests who, when the system works, which it hasn't always of late, conducts an investigation into allegations where it's alleged that the code of conduct has been broken. And we also have public inquiries as a mechanism whereby we can examine transgressions. And I might mention later on the COVID inquiry, public inquiry into the handling of the COVID pandemic here in the UK, where there is going to be a module, I think it's module 5, that looks into the procurement of goods, we would argue services too, during the pandemic. Things like the protected personal equipment, PPE, for which there are an awful lot of questions about how contracts were let and whether the system of public procurement was corrupted in the context of that emergency and led to decisions in which private interests were advanced at the expense of the public. But after all of that, you need there to be some consequence. And we've really struggled with that of late. One of the reasons I've noticed we've struggled about it in the last 6 or 7 years is the loss of the capacity for shame. The discourse in our politics has made it possible for some political actors to not experience shame, even when they are found to have transgressed codes of acceptable conduct, and to resist expressions of remorse. And there were reports that a former Prime Minister's Chief of Staff sent out an edict amongst the special advisors in the government that under no circumstances should we apologise for anything. And both the loss of capacity for shame and the inability to express remorse indicate that at a social cultural level, this accountability mechanism is breaking down. The other area where it breaks down is with regards to sanction. My colleague Rose Whiffen published an analysis last year of all of the potential breaches of the ministerial code which had gone uninvestigated. And there were 40 of them in the space of 5 years. And so the systems that we had were not actually being used to uphold standards in public life and to protect against corruption. Sanctions can be political, as in the case of the ministerial code, but potentially they can be financial and even criminal. What we will see is that this enforcement road is a long and slow one, and it's cumbersome, and it's hard to execute. So I would argue that while enforcement of rules has its place and is useful insofar as it serves as a deterrent, it's not very effective when it comes to actually, as we've been asked tonight, stopping corruption. If the conditions that allow corruption to thrive continue to exist, the punishment that comes with enforcement of rules may only displace one group of offenders for another to take their place, thus not stopping corruption either. 25 years ago, Professor Kierkegaard published what he described as a formula for corruption. It's not really a definition of corruption. It doesn't really serve us very well for that. But I think it's very useful when I ask myself this question about those conditions in which corruption thrives. And his formula is corruption equals monopoly plus discretion less accountability. So we've talked about accountability and we've talked about the limitations and the frustrations in using accountability as a way to reduce corruption. So the thought that I would leave you with tonight, and maybe we can explore later in conversation, is that we should look at these other elements. And in particular, I would focus on discretion, which in public life, in politics here in this country, would traditionally be described as patronage. But it can emerge in all sorts of fashions. But where a politician is able to exercise discretion, especially when that happens without effective accountability, and people have nowhere else to go as far as that decision is concerned, then the conditions for corruption are really ripe. So yes, deter, but perhaps let's return our focus to prevention. I'd invite you to think of any problem where you're concerned about the harm that it does, where prevention is not a more impactful response than responding to wrongdoing through means of enforcement. And because our enforcement mechanisms have broken down in UK politics in recent years around standards in public life, there's been a lot of attention about how do we make sure we really hold these people to account, we bring them to book, we round them up, we hound them out of office perhaps. But of course all of that is after the harm has been done. And if you care about the harms that were outlined in the introduction today, we really need to stop the corruption happening in the first place. I think there are three good ways to limit discretion in a way that stops corruption. The first is open, competitive, merit-based systems of appointments. I will contrast that, for example, with the way new members of the House of Lords are created in this country, seats for life in our Parliament, which are awarded through the political patronage of one politician. Secondly, competitive systems for procurement, in contrast to what the National Audit Office described as a priority lane, a VIP lane for people with good political contacts to have their propositions considered for government buying of PPE contracts, something which we in our report Track and Trace concluded represented systemic bias in the way those public functions were carried out. And thirdly, rules-based allocations for government support, be that business support or business loans, as we saw were necessary during the pandemic, or for economic regeneration, schemes like the Towns Fund, where there's been plenty of evidence surfaced through Select Committee and National Audit Office inquiries that public funds were directed to certain locations which suited the political interests of the decision makers rather than being awarded according to criteria, objective criteria that served the public interest. We should also address the vulnerabilities. What makes public officials vulnerable to being, to straying into corrupt acts? And in terms of our politics, it's the voracious appetite that our politicians have for funds for their election campaigns. And so by limiting public spending and controlling the donations that can be made to fund those campaigns, we can avoid situations where politicians are overly indebted to particular private actors. And also by better controlling what's called the revolving door, the way politicians move into jobs, sometimes in parallel with being an MP second jobs, but often after they've held public office, and the rewards that can be provided to them, and the situation which the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments is meant to prevent, whereby information which they hold as a result of what they were doing in their roles serving the public interests becomes valuable through their contact book, for example, to private interests that employ them subsequently, and in that respect abuse the power that was entrusted to them as ministers. So hopefully some alternative food for thought there about what we might do about corruption. Transparency by all means. We definitely need accountability to go with it. And ultimately, if we really want to address the harm caused by corruption, I think we need to start better designing out that discretion and that monopoly that is at risk of being abused in the first place.
Thank you so much. So this was a wonderful tour de force of corruption and transparency and anti-corruption. And so now we'll complement that with Dr. Fazekas, who will deep dive into one particular data source to combat corruption, and that is procurement.
Thank you. I must admit, I feel like reacting to your comments rather than giving my 10 minutes. But I will stick to my line, and then we can get back to it. Like a really great introduction. Okay, this works. So look, what I brought is far more kind of narrow and really focusing on this transparency, the kind of transparency we need for fighting corruption. And as Christian said, I will mainly focus on government contracting or public procurement, and simply because I think this is an area where there's a lot of transparency already, so we can ask a lot of questions about how that transparency is being used. And then it's quite funny, I just noticed that you are associated with the Transparency International, and also one of my affiliation is government transparency. So I think we are all biased in a sense, we think transparency is good, but I will tell you a few stories about why not all transparency is good for fighting corruption, and some are useless, or some forms of transparency might even be harmful. But first things first, so basically my argument is that transparency can be useful to fighting corruption, but only if it's relevant and useful, relevant and usable by the actors, and that could be companies, citizens, what have you, actors who have both motivation and the capacity or means to use that information. Okay, so we need quite a few things. Transparency, or the data, the information has to be of particular form and type, but that's not enough. You need someone or some group who will be actually using it for the kind of purposes you would want them to use it. So let's unpack that. So what kind of transparency? And this is it's very small, but anyways, I walk you through, and this is, there is far more detail in some of the publications I have co-authored with some of the colleagues. But basically, the idea is that first you need data which covers a wide scope of the government activities you want to measure, okay? So we go sector by sector, okay? You can think about government contracting, public appointments, so on and so forth. And a lot of governments play this game, you create a system where they publish some data. Lobby registers is a perfect example of this, right? You can have a nice website, you can have nice data standards, a lot of people saying, well, we are the champions of this. But if you look at the data, it is a tiny portion of what's relevant. Right? It's a frequent trick of what the corrupt leaders play. They try to say, okay, we are advancing transparency. They create registers, but they make sure that they are limited in their scope. Okay, so in public procurement, that's typically about, you limit what's being published. You don't publish defense contracts. You don't publish contracts for large sporting events, as if that was not, something where you would need competition. You don't publish special legal services, because if a law firm is helping you co-write a new bill in parliament, that somehow it's not of public interest, or you shouldn't have competition between firms. So, you make sure that there are these seemingly legitimate exceptions, but if you add them up, the scope of the data is very limited compared to what you would really want to have data on. Then the depth of information, you might have a lot of data, but not the details you need. The kind of important information would be missing from the public records. Okay, so you have a nice data set, but then what's inside of it, the list of variables, is something which is very limited, so you really cannot use it. Again, the game is to pretend that we are fighting corruption, we are being transparent here without actually doing it, right? Accuracy is another aspect of data. You have this nice government system that is supposed to be big and all sorts of interesting data, and then, well, our nice bureaucrats fail to fill in the forms, right? It's, again, very benign, very seemingly irrelevant, but actually it adds up, right? If you have some data, and then the government contracting data sets for the UK is, supposedly informing us where the money goes. But then if you open up these records, close to 30–40% of contract awards are without a contract value. So that's nice, transparent data. It's just we don't know how much money was spent. It's not really useful, right? So that's the sort of thing, again, we create a system which is seemingly transparent, but when you actually start looking at it, you want to use it, you realize that the accuracy of that data or the depth of that data is missing. Now, there is the next one, which is one of my favorites, and it's becoming a bit obscure. You need to access that data, okay? Often I get like, oh, why do you complain about not having data on these and these contracts and that government activity? It's all in the public domain. Yeah, thank you. It's scanned PDFs. That's for the asset and interest declarations. In a large number of countries, there is a big push for politicians to fill out these forms, and then it's rubbish. You cannot use them because they fill out some, random, addresses, and they say this is the size of my flat, and no one checks. You cannot cross-check that against a registry because it's handwritten. It's very hard to machine read that document. You cannot compare across years, how many flats did you own when you entered parliament, and how many do you own when you leave parliament. This is all very difficult when the data is there, but it's in a format that is made, I would argue in many cases, deliberately as hard to access and use as possible. Okay, so that's another problem. And then the final one is that the data is there's something relevant information in it, but you just cannot link it to other data sets which would really make it useful. Okay, so the beneficial ownership registers are, many of you might have heard about this. We want them, we love them, it's great, but it's yet another example of creating silos. Okay, so here is this list of company IDs and then some names who own those companies. Okay, that's great. I cannot do anything with it. I can do something with it if I link it to a property register. I can do something with it if I can link that to companies' financial records or procurement contracts. But it's all made very difficult because these are siloed, and often the data is not interoperable. You cannot match it up because the IDs are missing. Try matching 10 million firms on names and addresses to 1 million government suppliers. It's a research project of a year for 3 people. And then, yes, the data is there and transparent, but you cannot really use it. Okay, so you feel a bit of emotion in my words, and because this is my day-to-day, and these problems actually limit my capacity to use the data for anti-corruption. And I'm often upset and see governments telling me, like, you know, we put out all this useful data. Why don't people use it? Well, these are the 5 reasons why people don't use it. So why is it hard to get data right? So this is an example of I don't see it too well. So it's a bunch of middle and low-income countries looking at their public procurement data scope. And what the message of this very simple chart is that if I look at countries like Kenya and Bangladesh, their regulatory system, the transparency, the expectations is really there as the European average. I mean, if I put up the UK, it would be just slightly above the average of these countries. So on paper, these countries are super transparent. There's a lot of data out there. I could just go and give the local transparency chapter, hey, here is your data, fight corruption. And then if I compare that to how much data actually is in these systems, it's like a minuscule amount. Okay, you don't see this well. I tell you the story. So if I look at how much money Uganda spends from the budget on goods and services, procurement, I get an amount. Okay, it's 100. If I look at how much contracts we are using that register, which should register all the contracts, 5% of that. Okay, and the number is even smaller in Tanzania, it's 2%, okay? And if I open up that 5% of records and actually try to see how many fields are filled in following the rules, it's even less, okay? So I get to a minuscule amount, irrelevant amount of data. So the books are beautiful, the laws are passed, and implementation is basically rendering all of it is useless. Okay, and that's basically the problem with a lot of the transparency reforms is that we get as much as passing a new transparency law, maybe even setting up a government registry. But then what's in it? I often get like, oh, we never checked that. You know, we never checked that. I mean, so technicalities. Well, these are the technicalities which matter if you want to fight corruption using transparency. It's not relevant. I'm running out of time. So basically, transparency and data I covered, and then I think the previous speaker mentioned quite nicely a number of things you need for anti-corruption when you have good quality data. But what are these things? And I want to unpack these because often these other things are not there, and then this limits the use of transparency for anti-corruption. So the data is there, but we need an IT infrastructure which manages to process this data. And it is, again, a technical thing. But think about, the number of land titles in a country. Think about the number of contracts awarded in even a mid-sized country. We're talking about hundreds of thousands and often millions of records. It's not just I just pop up my laptop and then suddenly I hunt for corrupt politicians. You need a robust infrastructure in or outside government which allows you to use this data and regularly, recurrently, right? Anti-corruption is not a quick thing, unfortunately. If you look at the countries which succeeded, it's measured in decades, okay? So you want transparency to support this long-term effort. So you need this IT infrastructure. You need people and you need a software which allows you to use this information. Some people will have data science skills. They know what is R, what is Python. Some people will be using dashboards, but we need these tools, okay? And then the good news is that the cost of these dramatically dropped in the last 10 years. Heard about Tableau Public? Maybe you heard about it. It's a very nice way of putting data up in easy-to-use interactive dashboards. R is a free software. These tools used to be extremely expensive. Now they are free and state-of-the-art. So this really helps us fight corruption, but then you need skills, and that's my next point. You need people who know what to do with it, okay? And then my colleague is from Transparency International. I think I can tell you this story that once I was asked to give a data training, data for anti-corruption for a bunch of European TI chapters. And I was super happy because these are the bunch of people who fight for this data. And it turns out that the data they were campaigning for was very rarely opened, right? So the chapters themselves were arguing for a political finance registry or a lobbying registry. They were like, yeah, we got the data. Have you ever analyzed it? No, because it's dirty, it's messy, it's hard to work with it. So basically we spent 3 days on just getting the data as published by governments and trying to make sense of it. Okay? And then this is where you start to realize that just setting up a register is not going to get you to actionable insights, right? Because you want transparency to do something with it, and for that you need this hard work, cleaning the data, getting it the right format, understanding the patterns in it, understanding what's unusual in them, what's not. And this all takes a lot of time, and you need to educate the users. And you need to set a virtuous cycle in motion, that you start using the data, it's actionable, it's something you derive insights from, but you know what are the limitations of the data, and then you can go back and ask these and these things from the governments. And that was, I think, one of the outcomes of this workshop with TI chapters. Is not that we found 5 corrupt politicians, we didn't, but we knew what we needed from these data systems to actually have actionable insights, to really use the transparent registers for anti-corruption. And then often, I'm finishing. Often we end with having a nice report. And I love nice reports, that's my bread and butter, I'm sure the panel would agree. But what we need is organizational processes which embed anti-corruption, embed data use for long-term action, okay? Because often what happens with corruption and anti-corruption, there is a scandal, someone goes behind the bar, and then done. Unfortunately not, because the next politician will come and will use exactly the same tricks to steal money, okay? Or the next bureaucrat will be appointed by the politician, and the bureaucrat fill the pockets of the party or his or her own pocket. So we need systems which systematically prevent corruption, systematically fight corruption. For that, you need transparency, you need indicators, you need a pipeline, and you need an organization who lives with this, who uses this, okay? It's not just writing some, once a year a report, but really data use is embedded in the organizations, okay? And then educates its users, those who consume its dashboards, its reports, its investigations, to understand how important data it is. So that's why the sort of activity Christian is spearheading with some colleagues is super important. We need handbooks, we need training programs specifically for those who would use this data. Civil servants often have legal background or public administration background, and if I tell them, let's go to a dashboard and let's use it for, hunting for risky contracts or risky companies, they say like, oh, it's data, I'm afraid of it. We need to overcome that, okay? We need to overcome that sort of aversion to data and really make it part of organizational DNA, because the systems in which we are fighting corruption are enormous, okay? We have hundreds of thousands of contracts awarded in the UK. We have millions of companies in the UK. Without data skills and the kind of community of data users, this is not going to be useful. So I stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think those were 2 wonderful sets of presentations. I think the overall impression was that it's a little bit gloomy, which might reflect the state of the world and what we've experienced in the last decade in terms of corruption. But I was wondering if we could give the audience a little bit of hope here. So maybe starting with the procurement data. So Mihaly, you talked a lot about all the challenges in getting a data system in place that is complete, that is usable, that prevents corruption. So I was just wondering, can you give us some examples of where that is actually happening? So where the data analytics that have been done, at least for a subset of registries, have actually made a difference for corruption, and give us some hope that the state of the 2% in Tanzania or Uganda will not always determine the shape of the anti-corruption world.
Yes, this is a problem. We are too negative here, but we shouldn't focus on the negative. I think it's super important. So indeed, there are sometimes surprising, sometimes less surprising champions where things go well. And I think the good news is the sort of handbook Christian edited, the sort of the good practice guides, is that if someone really wants to do this, we know how to do it, right? We know how to set up these data sets, how to use them, how to build them into organizational activities. So places like Estonia, places like Ukraine, places like Chile, there are places which turned around the public administration quite quickly, quite rapidly, and they managed to use data in the process, transparency in the process, and then for these places, transparency doesn't just mean a freedom of information act. It means by default open, okay? And I think there are public administrations which try to build trust, try to fight corruption, try to strengthen integrity by building a e-procurement system, e-government systems which make public processes, awarding contracts, paying invoices, traceable, and make them transparent without any discretion. I think we need discretion, but when it comes to being open about what is happening to our taxpayers' money, we don't really like discretion. We want it by default open. And basically, I think with the tools we have, and again, the cost of these dramatically dropped in terms of setting up these IT systems and training civil servants in using them. So the fact that it is so much easier to do these things, if there is mandate, if there is political will, we see major changes in 2-3 years. Right? That takes time to really get these systems rooted, but you can really turn around civil service, parts of it at least in a few years. So I think there are positive examples, and then this should give us hope. Thank you.
Wonderful. I appreciate in the UK we are on a downward slope in terms of corruption, but I was wondering, are there, even within that overall trend, are there sort of positive highlights?
Well, I can give you a couple of reasons not to be so gloomy about it. Why has corruption in procurement of supplies during the pandemic been so shocking? Well, firstly, because of the scale, the volume of money that was being spent and misspent. And secondly, because frankly, just on a human level, it is quite shocking at a time when our health workers were, walking into danger, frankly, during the pandemic, that other people were preoccupied with how to make a quick buck, and it's just very hard to relate to. But the third reason is because it is so unlike what was happening before. It took the change of conditions of emergency procurement during the pandemic to make what we've since learned possible. And those methods were not available to them prior to the pandemic and shouldn't be available to them since. So that doesn't make it any less awful, but it does actually point to some of the strengths in public procurement in normal conditions. On the challenges that Mihaly gave us for how to kind of use data for anti-corruption efforts, I thought I would give you the case study of a platform that we have called Open Access, which you're all very welcome to have a look at online. I think the URL is transparency.org.uk/openaccess, all one word. And it's a very easy user interface. And it's to help shine a light on who has the ear of government ministers. So we don't have a lobbying register in the UK, but we do have declarations of ministerial meetings with external parties. And just as you indicated, they are published quarterly, late, and in PDF documents, typically. Nice. But we've done the hard work of cleaning up that data and putting it in an analyzable format. And at a click of a button, you can now see on our website, over the last 10 years, the organisation that has had the most ready access to UK government ministers is a company called BAE Systems, which perhaps won't surprise you, but it's also quite marked how much more access they have than others. And this is very useful for journalists who use this platform to write stories every time this data is updated, shining a light on what's been going on in terms of who's been trying to influence ministers around contentious decisions. But it still has shortcomings, to acknowledge your analysis, Mihaly, and it's about completeness, frankly, because although I've been assured by government regulators that this shouldn't be the case, in practice, when government ministers hold a business day at their party conference, at which businesses pay a lot of money to be guaranteed a seat on a table, cabaret style, with a cabinet minister, none of those cabinet ministers record any of the meetings that they have that people have paid for. They've selling access. They don't record any of these in their declarations, because the only way meetings get into these declarations, these returns, and then ultimately into our platform, is if there's a civil servant in the room, in the department, who's recorded that the meeting's taken place and ensured that it's drafted up in the declaration for the minister to publish. And of course, they're not at the party conferences. So actually, in those instances which are most vulnerable to corruption, where the politicians are selling access to government ministers, we don't have the record keeper producing the transparency declaration. So we still have some of the problems that you outlined, even if we've overcome a few of them.
Mm-hmm. Super.
Well, very interesting. All right, let's open it up to questions from the audience. And if there are multiple of you, we'll take up to 3 questions at a time. So please. We have a question there in the back. Oh, sorry, we can start here in the front, actually, and you don't have to walk so far.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you very much. My name is Natalia. I study MPA at the Department of Political Science here. And I just made a small micro research about transparency of local governance in the UK. It's a very interesting topic. And I'm really impressed with what you said about that the transparency is not enough because without ability to use this information. And the thing that I discovered while doing my research is that while reading all these amazing reports from the auditors who revealed some cases of corruption, that councillors and the members of the public are not able to actually discover that cases. So even if their information is available. And when they interviewed them, they said that the scrutiny commissions or audit commissions inside local governments, they just are not motivated to intervene. For example, when the local council made a contract without any procurement. This happens in the UK. I'm very surprised with that, but still. I came from Russia, and in Russia, Transparency International made amazing workshops when they trained local councillors and activists and whoever wanted to join how to use the information available to make investigations, to attract media. And also, local governments are mostly neglected from attention. I mean, everyone is concentrated on central governments, and local governments is something that's interesting. And even if there is some cases of corruption there, nobody just care about that. Maybe the scale is small. So, what do you think about? I'm just did a small research. Maybe you know more about it. Are you agree that this corruption on the local level is neglected? And what can we do to educate people more how to use that information? Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful question. We'll take 2 more. Here. Here.
Hi, my name's Connor. I'm a PPE student here at UCL. I kind of have 2 questions. So the first is, there's sort of a growing number of public affairs companies in the UK or just in politics in general around the world. I was wondering why do you think public affairs companies and consultancies are growing in number? I was wondering perhaps maybe it's to do with a lack of resources, particularly amongst parliamentarians, but I'm sort of curious in your thoughts for that. And then secondly, I'm also interested in sort of the impact that technology has on sort of the relationships between pressure groups and outside influences on sort of government members or parliamentarians. So, you know, like things like WhatsApp, for example, an MP could be sitting in a committee discussing a particular issue and they could get a WhatsApp message from someone who's, you know, at the back of the room listening in. How do we sort of capture those, you know, really small sort of instances, those really subtle things that you know are potentially off the record, but you know could have a big influence on that MP's particular contribution in that committee. And I'm sure there are many more examples of that. So why the growing influence and rise of public affairs companies, and then also how do we capture those sort of subtle instances of lobbying, particularly using technology? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll stop here because those were already 3 questions from the audience. And so maybe for the first question, I'll hand it over to you, and then maybe you can have a go at 2 and 3.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the question. And indeed, I'm very much with you that there is a lot of attention on the national level, on the capital, on the big projects, and then very little interest from investigative media, from civil society on what's happening on the local level. And I think this is partially also from the media. I mean, if you look at the real media which covers local topics as opposed to just copy-pasting or rehashing some national or international news, I think it's also very limited. So I think it's partially a resources issue, right? I mean, if you have a smaller town, then it's much harder to pay the salaries of those journalists. So I think it's hard to get around those economic pressures. And I think there is also an issue, and that is a strong link to corruption/favoritism, which is if you have a smaller community, it's really often everyone knows everyone, at least in those elite circles. So it's like you don't have that sort of ferocious competition between different parties and companies, because look, if the 2 companies could fix your roads, the CEOs went to the same primary school and high school, and they married each other and cousins, because it's I don't push this further, but you get the point, right? So it's much harder to rely on the usual kind of prescriptions of anti-corruption, openness, competition, because the pool is small, right? So you really need to have different mechanisms, and I'm not sure we crack those, what that could be. But I would also mention one of our papers which looked at local corruption in Sweden, and then one as a sister paper of that in the UK. And then one thing which we found is that if there is no local political change, so the mayor is always coming from the same party, then these self-control mechanisms, exactly this audit commission or any sort of accountability from the mayor to the local council, they break down, right? Because over time, basically, it just becomes basically one group where everyone backs up. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. So I think some degree of breaking up these local elite groups, I think this is very much necessary, right? And then you probably will not get the high-quality investigative journalists to go after local cases, because that's just not happening in small cases. So that is a hard one to get, but there are some entry points definitely around political competition on the local level.
Thank you. Great questions, both of you. So, Natalia, I hope you'll come and speak to me afterwards, and I can put you in touch with our researchers that do work on the government in the UK. We publish reports called Permission Accomplished, just to prove that using puns for the titles of your reports doesn't actually increase the readership. But it's very good reports about how the accountability mechanisms in local government have fallen into disrepair. And there was analysis, I think it was 30 different local authorities in the UK, and some recommendations which led to a 10-point plan that we suggested to candidates for the mayoralty in Liverpool, given the problems that the city of Liverpool had had with corruption. I don't think they were actually taken up, but they have, I think, agreed to get rid of the mayoral system in Liverpool, which addresses my earlier point about monopoly and discretion. In local government, especially where we've had these executive mayors, there's been quite a monopolization of decision-making in a single person's hands. And where we've had major regeneration schemes, such as in places like Teesside, with some very interesting governance structures around them that lack accountability, there is also quite a high degree of political discretion, including around appointments. And these increase the scope for corruption to take place. I don't have the evidence to tell you that these have been corrupt deals, but people have published some very interesting reports about them. So let's follow up later. Connor, I agree with your analysis that growth in public affairs firms is a kind of de facto privatization of policymaking, because the capacity for policymaking has been hollowed out. The extent to which that's something that the civil service can do on its own for ministers in many areas, not all areas, but many areas, is much weaker than it was. people will argue about whether or not that's a good thing, by the way, but I think that's well observed. And the role of technology, well, you know me, I can remember back in the day, I had a BlackBerry, and I would be exchanging messages with a researcher in another office whilst I was sat in the House of Commons, as I tried to be as on the minute as possible with my interventions. And so it's absolutely right to observe that our politicians are very well connected with those sources of information they wish to be well connected to. And frankly, the WhatsApps that are part of the COVID inquiry are shining quite a light onto how government is moving away from channels of good record keeping and accountability, and that presents new challenges. I mean, ironically, WhatsApp as a platform is a very simple way to capture in real time those conversations, but that isn't what's happening, because they're all going on to auto-deletion. And the guidance that Whitehall is giving remains that somehow ministers are expected in real time to discern which part of these conversations is government business and draw that to attention to an aide, a civil servant, to properly document, and know that they don't need to keep the rest. And I mean, that's just not the reality of how people work when they're that busy. So we are going to, unless a better system is developed, we're going to lose a lot of valuable information about how decisions are made. And that does matter at the end of the day. Because the reason for the COVID inquiry is that society should learn lessons from an extraordinary set of circumstances so that we can do a better job for people, and ultimately lives depended on that. The technology is changing the way they operate. I think we should just be a bit careful about assuming all of this is bad, right? If we're open to seeing how we could use this for good and make a positive case, rather than assume that we have to kind of always do things the way they were always done before, I think we need to be a bit more creative in the solutions that we find.
If I can add to that exactly on the positive side. So I think if you compare situation 20 years ago, calling up someone or just chatting on the corridor versus some WhatsApp message, our capacity to record conversation between politicians and different actors dramatically increased. A big part of it actually is privatized, right? Because often these messenger services have a server in the US or somewhere in Europe recording those, right? So I've seen quite a few investigations. I live in Vienna in Austria, like ex-minister being investigated based on the backup data the anti-corruption authority obtained from Apple. The guy didn't know that there was a backup. He thought if he loses his phone, then he's safe. He lost his phone, but then the data was sitting in the US, and then they could get it. So there's a chance here, right? It's complicated to navigate, because if the data sits in the US or sits in some other country and you get it, WhatsApp is encrypted. How to this? There are questions, but our capacity to use that to hold politicians to account may well dramatically increase, because it's no longer just some chatter on a corridor, but it's actually someone writing it down in a WhatsApp message.
Very interesting. Right. Next round of questions. We'll start here.
Thank you. My name's Finn, and I'm in year 12. My question is mostly for Duncan, as he mentioned the PPE contracts in the pandemic. Obviously, we had a Conservative government at that point, but do you think the situation or the outcome would have been much different had it been a Labour government or any other party? Or do you think the corruption that we do have in our system is the same, and it's an all-party issue rather than just the Conservatives?
Right. Then the lady over there.
Thank you for your sharing. My name is Miri, and I'm also a PPE student at UCL. My question was that I was really interested in what Dr. Hames, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, mentioned about the current loss of a capacity for shame among corrupt politicians. My question is, how do you think that, because that's more of a cultural problem, how that could be resolved? It seems to me that a lack of shame might be related to that politicians likely longevity in parliament, because if you know that you're not going to get kicked out, it's more likely that you can act in questionable ways and not have to be ashamed about it. So especially even if in the Tory government in the UK or in more authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia where it's harder to remove someone from their position, do you think there's any hope for reforming a corrupt politician? Thanks.
Third.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a second-year history student here at UCL. And I think your discussion, not our discussion, has focused so far on elected public officials. These officials have the incentive to be transparent and not be corrupt because they might be punished at an election by their constituents or whoever elects them. How do we encourage unelected public officials and unelected governing bodies, such as, say, FIFA, to act in a non-corrupt and transparent way? Although there's a big appetite to hold these officials to account, it doesn't seem like we have the tools to do so. And is that because they're unelected?
Thank you very much. Do you want to start, Duncan?
Yes, God, I think those are the hardest ones. Let me start with the PPE contracts. Finn, I certainly don't believe that corruption is something that only one political party or one political school of thought is at risk of. And you can see it in different countries, different sorts of political parties in power, but you can also see it over time. It might manifest in different ways. I think the risks are different. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that therefore one party is more corrupt than another. But you know, if you fundraise from business, if your social networks are private interest in business, then the potential for private interest to come into conflict with the public interest is very, very great. And so I think you can probably see different risks with different groups of politicians because of their own networks. You know, I would argue that when one union baron decides that he can somehow marshal all of the union subs of every one of his members and wield political influence according to his own personal political agenda, that is still not democratic, frankly. But that's a very different kind of phenomena to an entrepreneur who gets given a seat in the House of Lords and then uses her political contacts to promote the offer of PPE supplies to government ministers, and then uses offshore tax havens to hide the fact that she's got any connection to these businesses. So those are very different kind of phenomena. I don't think any of us are without risk of being corrupted, actually, which comes to the question from Mary about reforming a corrupt politician. I mean, different people behave in different ways for different reasons, and we shouldn't overgeneralize. But I think it's really important, speaking as a recovering politician myself, to try and understand how politicians might slip into doing something which is corrupt. Right? Some people would tell you that pork barrelling is corrupt, and I used the example of the Towns Fund earlier as a possible illustration. I think when I was a politician, there was an expectation to try and get the best out of government for the area that you represented. There was a kind of championing of your local area going on. Well, there's quite a thin line from championing the interests of your local constituency to engaging in pork barrelling, right? And you might not do it in a transactional way, but it might just be that it's easier for you to advocate for your local area if you've been supportive of the very people that you're trying to advocate to. So I would think, rather than framing it in the context of reforming, I think it is important to understand how a context can influence an individual. And can we look at how that context operates and make it one which isn't conducive to corruption or doesn't lead people into certain positions. So I mentioned earlier election campaign finance. Yeah. If politicians don't have to spend a lot of time fundraising to get money to spend on their election campaigns, they are going to find themselves far less often in risky situations where they're having conversations with people who might expect something in return. So back to my original thesis about designing corruption out of the way we do public service. I haven't answered Charles's question. I'm sorry. I'm not sure.
On FIFA,
Yeah,
I don't know how to regulate that. Probably, disciplining FIFA is beyond the wisdom of this room. No, but seriously, so we talked a lot about politicians, right? So indeed, unelected officials, bureaucrats, it's a little bit of a different beast. And I think in one way, there is far more research on corruption in bureaucracy and anti-corruption in bureaucracy. We know far better what to do. And then I think one of the main reasons, going back to Duncan's formula, or Klitgaard's formula, actually, discretion. Right? A lot of the things bureaucrats do are very highly regulated. Okay, so if compare it with a politician, goes in parliament and, tables whatever, modification he or she wants for the particular law in case. There's no, clear benchmark. But a bureaucrat, you control unemployment benefits. You administer whatever, applications for a particular fund, setting up a firm. A lot of it is very highly regulated. So in those contexts, what constitutes corruption is far clearer because the rules, the expectations of how you should behave are far more well established and far narrower. We still need bureaucrats with discretion, right? Because there are situations we cannot write in a rule book and just ask people to implement that rule book. So I'm not saying this is without that problem, but a large part of what's happening is more manageable in a classic sense of let's write those rules, well and clear, then monitor them and see if someone deviates from those rules. And I think there has been a large body of research on, bribery in police, schools, healthcare, and we I think far closer to knowing what we need to do than disciplining politicians who engage in pork barrel. Probably it's very hard to crack.
Wonderful. Let me also briefly abuse my role here as chair, as a scholar of bureaucracy. Just to add that it's really important to disassociate bureaucrats from other unelected officials in the sense that we actually know quite a lot about how to manage corruption with bureaucracy. Inside bureaucracy, we know a lot less about how to manage corruption in FIFA. So I just want our audience to disassociate these two types of groups. All right, next round of questions. We have one there at the back.
Hi, I'm Maisie. I'm also in Year 12. My question is to do with public participation in politics, and because there's been a sort of participation crisis has been almost increasing over the past decades, and I think that's sort of to do with how corruption is becoming more advanced, rather than increasing, it's becoming more advanced. And I was wondering, do you think that an increase in transparency would encourage more public participation in democratic process and in politics?
Wonderful, thank you. And then I think we had a question here in the back.
Hi, my name's Ham. I'm from the School of Public Policy. I'm doing an MPA. My question is, we talked a lot about data procurement and accuracy, but in South Asian countries, as we saw, like in Bangladesh and India, Pakistan, there's not a lot of transparency with data and a lot of missing data. And then corruption itself is an institution, quite an efficient one, but it itself constitutes, if you go by World Bank and IMF data, it's 20 to 50% of the GDP. So how do you get around corruption in a country where the corruption is so, first of all, efficient? People like corruption and it's easier to get work done through corruption. And how do you then keep the lawmakers kind of accountable in that situation? Because why would, since all the power is concentrated towards the lawmakers and the media, and then you have a parallel economy which is worth $400 billion. So you don't have data for that. So my question is, how do you keep an account of something which does not exist?
All right. And then I think we have time for one final question. The lady here in the front.
Hi, thank you. Thank you both for your talks. I'm a PhD student at LSE and I study corruption and conflicts of interest in healthcare. So it's sort of a two-part question, but I'll keep it brief. Corruption seems to be generally a global south problem, and anti-corruption is often a global north solution. And I feel like what especially Duncan has talked about quite a lot today is the fact that global north also suffers quite a lot from corruption in various shapes and forms. And I wonder how can, especially Western countries, remain these anti-corruption champions and lobbyists for various anti-corruption policies when they cannot really cope with it domestically. And then, no, actually, let's keep it at that. I think that's that's a pretty big question in its own right. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Natalie, do you want to start?
Okay, so let me pick up the transparency and public participation one. So this is a very good one. I thank you for this question. So there is this pretty bad policy advice, like we should run anti-corruption awareness-raising campaigns. We should run, we should tell people that corruption is bad. And usually these campaigns achieve nothing. And there is now increasingly, high-quality experimental evidence saying that they actually backfire. So telling people, oh, corruption is very bad in your country, in a situation when you might have an autocracy or might have a semi-democracy which doesn't give you the root, the tools to use that information, it leads to resignation. People become less willing to fight corruption if they get the big billboards, oh, your country is falling apart because of corruption, because then you say, okay, what do I do? And I cannot do anything because the elections are rigged, because the bureaucracy is not listening to me. So then basically a lot of these classic policy advice of we need people to be aware of corruption and then we need more transparency about these problems, they actually decrease public participation. So I think this is getting back to my point that it's only ever makes sense to increase transparency with the aim of anti-corruption if you have then the tools for the users of that information to actually do something about it. Just transparency on its own, at best it's useless, at worst it's actually leading to more corruption because people are less willing to fight corruption. On the problems of Bangladesh, I have quite some research on Bangladesh and then some other countries you mentioned. So the answer is I have no idea, right? So this is such a big problem, and if you see the countries which actually came out of that sort of pervasive amount of corruption, that is decades of fundamental reform. So I think that sort of a big bang, changing a lot of things all at the same time and pushing for decades. I think this is a very hard one. But there is some very smart research on using interest and corrupt networks to still make marginal improvements, right? So you can identify the actors who lose from corruption. And I don't believe then the average Bangladeshi would say, oh, corruption is good, I like it. No, I don't think. I think people benefit from corruption, and then for certain things you might, every citizen might benefit from it, but there's a lot of losers, right? So fighting corruption step by step by recognizing who are the losers and giving them tools to organize collective action against corruption. I think this is something which has proven to be useful even in pervasively corrupt places where you cannot just suddenly change everything because this is the nature of governance. This is the political settlement, as some researchers call this. And what I want to say, and then I think we haven't emphasized this enough, that there are very different kinds of corruption, right? And you do different things against different kinds of corruption. So if you have a good prescription to fight petty corruption in police, like transport police, it's certainly a very different kind of prescription from how to stop pork barrel in Parliament in the UK, right? These are just different roads. We call them corruption, but they're not really the same thing. So when you say, how do we fix the corruption problem in Bangladesh, my answer would be, you fix it in different ways. If you talk about transport police abusing its powers to fine people and then asking for bribes in return, then you need to have a specific solution to that. And then again, very different from procurement, so on and so forth. So I think this is just a general message. Yes.
Great. I mean, I don't know a lot about Bangladesh, but I do know that there are more people working on anti-corruption in Transparency International Bangladesh than in any other Transparency International chapter in any other country in the world. So I can definitely point you to some people that don't like corruption. But let me briefly tell you about a time when I think I paid a bribe. It was 25 years ago, and it was in Istanbul. And don't worry, the police don't watch YouTube. I was in Istanbul, and the plane, we were going through border control. And I'd been told in advance by my boss, because I was very young at the time, still very young, obviously, that we needed to have some cash available to put in these boxes at border control. I mean, they were like tissue boxes on the counter of the kind of immigration control desks, right? But they all had them, and everyone was putting cash into these boxes. Cash, right? I mean, what do you think is the likelihood that that money ended up in the national exchequer of the Turkish government, right? Zip. And people were paying. I don't think they liked paying. I don't think they felt that that made public service more efficient for them. But what we often find is that friction points, and that's a friction point, are very vulnerable to corruption. And where you have person-to-person contact and discretion, you see all these ingredients for corruption are in that example. You can design these out, and modern technology helps you do so. And even though I don't have free movement across the European Union anymore, I still often get to use e-borders gates, and these are automated. And there isn't an opportunity for someone to extract a bribe from me in those instances. I think we can probably find illustrations of efficient government that also remove the friction that creates the possibility for corruption, which was my original thesis, right? Let's go to prevention. Let's actually design this out in the first place. I didn't catch your name earlier. Eva, thank you. What you're working on sounds fascinating. We have a health team, and I hope you'll get in touch, and you know them. Great, good. I love your observation about the hypocrisy of global North governments, but let me turn it on its head for you. For those of us trying to get action out of those global North governments in their own societies, in their own departments, exposing the potential or demonstrating the potential for that hypocrisy to be exposed is a point of leverage. So it's a means whereby we can try and get them to address the problems in their own backyard. So it's not a point that's lost on us, and we try and do some good with it. But I think in terms of a moral point, it's a point that you make well. I was at an event with a British government official sat next to me from the Foreign Office in September, an international conference on open government, and we were talking about civil society and public participation, and the Foreign Office, of course, is very much in favour of these things all around the world. At the same time, the British government at home is curtailing the right to protest and is doing quite a lot of things which curtail our civic space. And, it was my job to expose that hypocrisy on that occasion. And I suspect the official rather agreed because, his job is to advocate for expanding civic space. And unfortunately, foreign policy officials don't have much influence over what goes on in their own countries. And then I think Maisie's question is a really hard one. When I first stood for Parliament, it was very hard to get public participation. Rates of voting were very low. This was 23 years ago. And although I wasn't supporting the party of government at the time, I would offer the thesis that one of the reasons why people weren't motivated to engage in politics at the time was because there wasn't a lot going wrong. And there's plenty of motivations for people to get involved in politics today. I think it's a different thing which is obstructing participation. It's the sense that actually there isn't political equality, that everyone who engages in politics is not going to be heard equally. That if you don't live in the right constituency, which is marginal and which might change hands, your vote doesn't matter. That if you're in a demographic group which isn't as likely to vote as another, you'll find the political parties focus their policy innovations on the group that they think is going to vote. And we have a situation in our country. Someone asked earlier about, how do you incentivize good conduct when people don't fear the loss of their political careers, right? The way we structure our political system insulates some politicians from that kind of accountability. And so again, I think, the way you design these things, you can actually protect against these phenomena. Unfortunately, there's a lot of vested interest in keeping things the way they are.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for these wonderful questions. Before we thank our speakers, let me remind you of our next Policy and Practice event, which is entitled Democratic Resilience in the Age of AI. That will happen next Thursday evening. You can sign up via our website or Eventbrite. If you don't already, please do follow us on Twitter or on X. Our X handles are UCL SPP and UCL Policy Lab. So on behalf of the School of Public Policy, the Department of Political Science, and the UCL Policy Lab, thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you so much for our two wonderful speakers.
Pleasure.
Thank you.